welcome to another episode of Dog Talk. Today I'm going to talk about scientific studies on dog training, or also scientific studies in more general terms, because it's not just about dogs. The problems that I'm going to outline that we're seeing in dog training related studies are not unique to dog training studies. So we're going to talk a little bit about how this is supposed to be and what the deviations are these days that we're unfortunately seeing way too frequently. And this is not just my opinion. You can listen to all kinds of podcasts from scientists and authors and researchers that have spoken on this topic on a variety of podcasts and interviews. This is not my unique perspective on it. It's a generally accepted problem, and there isn't an easy remedy for it either. But it's just something to be aware of when you are confronted with scientific studies, because there is a lot in the dog training world where people will tout studies for this and that, and then claiming that their view is correct or their approach is correct based on the study, when the study cannot be validated or was just a survey or can't be tested or was a one-off. Like there's so many things that can be misleading. And I want to equip you a little bit more to judge if a study you're looking at or a study that's being sold to you is worth the paper it's written on in a fairly quick way, because nobody can read all this stuff, right? So I read a lot of studies, but that's not something I would expect most people to do. And understanding how you can quickly, from an abstract or just from a paragraph about the setup, identify if this is even worth reading to begin with, or if anything they found is even worth looking at. So let's take a quick look at how it's supposed to be. So let's say there is an observation that somebody makes, and it could be something very historical, like a leaf falling off a tree. Hello, Isaac Newton, right? So somebody makes an observation, and based on that observation, they're thinking, well, why is this happening? Or I don't quite understand, or I think this could be this or that, right? So based on that, they're forming a hypothesis, which is their thoughts on why this is going on. Something is pulling the leaf to the ground, or something is pushing the leaf to the ground. And based on that hypothesis, you set up an experiment that you want to test now your idea. So you have to set that up now in a way that it eliminates all other factors and just focuses on what you want to actually test. So you isolate your idea in a way that it couldn't be something else. And that's not always possible, but you have to do it as good as possible, per se. You have to put an effort in and be as good about it as you reasonably can be, and then still understanding, well, there are these other factors that may or may not influence it, but we can't really isolate them here right now. Maybe we can look at this later. Let's just like test the base idea first and see if you can isolate it more down the line if necessary. But now we have an hypothesis, and we set up an experiment to test the hypothesis. So in the outcome of that experiment can be a couple of different ways. The experiment could show what I hypothesized is happening. So I would now have evidence for my hypothesis. Or it could show something entirely different that's completely unrelated to what I was trying to do, and I come up with something completely new, different, that is unrelated to what I was looking at. I'll give you an example for that in a moment. Or I'm 100% proven incorrect. Okay, my experiment shows me what I was thinking can't be true. So that's basically the three scenarios you can think of. Or it could be partially true, right? It could be some of about it could be true. When you test it more, that's the other option. But so far, here's an example of where somebody tested something and came up with something quite significant that had absolutely nothing to do with what they were doing. And that is Ivan Pavlov, who discovered, documented classical conditioning, which is super important in dog training and many other aspects of life. But he wasn't looking for that. He was studying digestion. So in the study of digestion, he came across this thing that became this massively important finding of classical conditioning. That's quite a lucky find. But that's how it sometimes goes, right? So that's an example of how you could find something that's actually even really relevant when you're looking for something else. So after we've tested our hypothesis, let's say it was proven, now we're going to publish it. So that study that we did will now be written up in all aspects, and it should contain all the information needed to repeat the study and validate my results. And then we're going to publish it in a scientific paper that is hopefully related to the field where we're doing something in. Right? So if we're testing something with a virus, it should probably be in a biology paper of some sort. So then when it's published, other scientists can look at the study, can look at what you did, and they can test it, they can accept it, they can challenge it, they can try to invalidate it with what you provided because you were supposed to give all the details to do this with. And then it can be either become something that becomes accepted in the scientific community or not, based on other people testing it. So let's say everybody who wants to reruns your experiments, and they come to the same conclusion, and nobody can prove you wrong. So you basically set up the wonderful experiment that seems to be actually has actually found something that we didn't know, and it seems to be true because you're a genius. So you found something that's significant, and everybody who tests it comes to the same conclusion and says, wow, and you're going to get a Nobel Prize, right? So basically, perfect scenario. So after we had a lot of people tested and validated, it becomes at some point a theory. Maybe there's still some unanswered questions, maybe there's still some gaps, but overall, this seems to be true. We can't really refute it. We may not have all the answers we don't understand it maybe fully, but essentially it's true. We haven't found any counterindication. So an example that in my lifetime would be basically evolution. I know it's controversial in America, it really shouldn't be, but I don't want to get into that, but like in terms of progression. So when I was a teenager, when I was in school, evolution was considered a theory. There were missing links, there were gaps in our chain of evidence of how this could have all come down from the origin of species from Darwin. But then over my lifetime, every once in a while, I would read an article in a scientific journal or even on the news if it was significant enough. All the gaps that still made that a theory were eventually closed. I think like 10 years ago or so, I forget the 10 years, but in a not so distant recent future time, all the questions were answered and all the gaps were closed, and it stopped being a theory. There wasn't a specific time where somebody said, okay, evolution is no longer a theory, it's now scientific fact. Actually, as Dawkins said at one point, we should stop calling it a theory. We really have to stop. But I think that was like a couple of years ago. And it's basically at this point a scientific fact. That is how it went. And unless we would stumble upon some kind of revolutionary insight that would put everything in question we have accepted as fact, we wouldn't retest it either at this point, because the evidence for the last 4 or 5 decades has been so overwhelming in confirming this at its core that there is no point. So you would have to stumble upon something that would invalidate it, because nobody has been able to disprove it. I mean, I know some people don't believe any of it, but that's not really evidence of anything. That's just what you believe. But that's a personal truth. That's not an objective truth. That's a different conversation. But that's basically what happens. So if you can't disprove it, you close all the knowledge gaps, it becomes a scientific fact, and it will stand unless something unforeseen happens that puts it in question again, which sometimes happens, but it's not very common. Well, that's the overall perfect lineup of something like this can go. But it requires a few things, right? It requires that when you publish your paper, when you publish your study, that there's everything in there that allows someone else to validate it. If it cannot be validated because not everything was provided, now the results become questionable, because we can't test it, we can't prove you right or wrong, we can't confirm or deny. We would have to just take your word for it, and this is not how science works. taking someone's word for it has nothing to do with science, and just believe that you miraculously will right, but we can't test it. That's not how this goes, right? So if we can't validate it, it's never gonna advance to a theory or a fact. It's just okay. That's cute. That's an interesting finding, but we have no idea what you did here. We have no idea how you went about it. We have no details. You didn't tell us. It's all missing. So it ends right there, right? It's like not something worth looking at this point. And then it gets more tricky when you have some information provided, but not enough to really do it right. And that is kind of where questionnaires and surveys really come in, because there's a lot of studies now that are based on questionnaire and surveys. So you may think, well, what's wrong with that? We do polling and everything, right? We ask people questions and see where they stand. There's nothing wrong with that, as long as you understand what you're doing and what the limitations of that are. So let me give you a couple of examples. So when I was in college, I have a master's degree and in management information systems. And one of the courses I had to take as part of my economics majors was empirical research. And empirical research or empirical statistics is basically the science of questionnaires, polling, surveys, and so on. You learn every aspect of structuring the question, analyzing the results, sample sizes, and so forth. And the first thing our professor said in the very first lesson, and he said it with a smirk, was but he was serious. He was not joking. It was just like, it's a cute thing to say, but he was not joking at all. He meant it. And through the course, we understood what he meant. He said this: never trust a statistic you haven't falsified yourself. And there is a lot of truth in that, if you understand how this works. So let's start off with a sample size first. I'm not going to get too complicated. I just want to highlight a couple of problems with surveys and polling. So you have to, when you select your sample, if you do it correctly, you have to try to find a sample that represents the population as a whole in every aspect. You can see from that alone that is quite complex. It would require different walks of life to be the same in your sample group of, let's say, 1,000 people, than in the United States, 330 million. So we would have to have the correct mix of ethnicities, the correct mix of genders, the correct mix of educational background, the correct mix of cultural background. You can go down the line of so many different factors. It's a never-ending specification. It is impossible. Not literally or just like mostly. No, it is absolutely impossible to have a sample that is identical to the whole, unless it's designed in a lab where the whole is controlled in the lab. The sample is never controlled. And if the whole is the entire population of a country, forget that. So you approximate certain things to come to a result that's close enough in a way. So when you have, for example, in election polling, we've seen there to be a lot of variation in the last couple of election cycles. Polls have been kind of off. But you always have this variance in there. There's always a margin of error. Well, what's a margin of error? The margin of error is because my sample is not going to represent the country as a whole, and it's also not going to represent what will show up on election day, because you don't know who's going to show up. You take educated guesses about it from the past. You can guess well. We used to guess well when it came to that, and it was easier when people had rotary phones in their homes, and that's what you would, because that's what they're calling. They're calling people with landlines. But that's changed, right? People no longer have landlines, and the people who do are usually older, so you get a different sample group there. It's very difficult to survey younger people who just have cell phones and don't have any landlines. So there's a lot of complexities to even do this, even if you want to be accurate. And a lot of poll researchers want to be accurate. I mean, their bread and butter is to be as correct as possible. So they have an interest. But it's super difficult to get it right, even if you want to. But it's very easy to just get it wrong if you don't care or if you want to get it wrong because you want a certain group of people to get a certain outcome. So that's what the sample size is. Just know that whatever group you're polling will never represent the whole. It's just impossible to do. The question is only how much is it off. And that, again, how much it is off is also a guesswork because there's no way of knowing. With like an election where people show up and vote, you can see on the makeup of who showed up and vote, well, what did we sample and who showed up to vote? So you now have a comparison. You can see how you were off, and then you could adjust based on that for the next round. But when you do a survey with dog owners, or you do a survey on whatever, where you don't even have an after, where you know that's everybody now, and that's what everybody said, you don't have that. Your survey result is just 100 times worse because you have no idea what you're actually getting. You're just hoping that it's going to be reflective of the country as a whole, but you have no way of validating that. There's no way to refute it. There's no way to prove it. There's no way to be sure. You just have no idea. It's an inherent flaw in polling and surveys and questionnaires. It's just the nature of it. There's no nefarious thing going on, although there could be, but it doesn't have to be for it to be off. And if you have never a control group of the entire population that will give you the correct distribution, you can't even adjust for a margin of error in a question about dogs. It's just not possible. So samples is one problem. Second problem is the question that you ask. And obviously, when you have something like an election poll, they really want to get it right. So they're trying to figure out how do we ask this in a way that we get a really good take on what's probably going to happen because they want this to be correct. But when you want to manipulate a study, if you want a particular outcome, now that's a beautiful way of manipulating that because most people have absolutely no way of catching you. Even other scientists can't really catch you unless you provide every decision point of your sample size in it, which they never do. Right? It's just people signed up on this website. Okay, how was that promoted? So you just never know. So the type of questions you ask now also makes a big difference. So let me give you I'm going to give you a very extreme example just to highlight the problem. This is an example where the second example may upset you, but please don't stop listening because of it. It's just I want to make a point of clarity, and this is just a good example I came up with. So if we asked people in a survey, would you like the United States government to pass a law that will prohibit doctors from saving people's lives? Do we want the government to pass a law that will prevent doctors from saving people's lives? We would hope the majority of people will say no to that. I'd like to say everybody would say no to that, but we know that's not true. It's never everybody. There's always going to be some people who think that's a great idea. I don't want to meet those people, but we know they exist. So let's just say it's like 0.1% of people say this is a great idea. But the 99.9% of us who understand what's being asked here think, yeah, that's not a good call. We should not have the government pass a law that prevents doctors from saving our lives. It's not a good idea, right? So, but that's question type 1. So now let me ask the same question in a much narrower way with more specificity, but it is essentially the same question. It's going to have a very different outcome. So if the question is, should the government ban abortions in all cases, even if it includes the life of the mother? So that's the controversial part, right? The abortion question. But that's going to result in a very different outcome with a sample group in America. So we know this because that's been our research, and the research on that has obviously all the flaws I talked about already. But it's approximately 9 to 10% of people in America think it should be illegal in all cases, even if the mother dies. So that's an extreme position, but we know that 9 to 10% of people hold it. very different outcome than hopefully our 0.1 or 1% of like, should we have doctors not save people in general? Just based on how we ask that question, we're going to get a very different result. But it's not really a different question. It just narrows it down to a group of people, in this case women, and it narrows it down to a specific scenario. It gives you a specific example of what it could be, but it just restricts it to basically women versus everybody. But the outcome of the question will be different in the survey now, a completely different poll result. And you can do this, again, this was an extreme example, I get it, but you can do this with every single question, no matter what the topic is. You can find a way to manipulate the way you ask to guide the person in a specific direction. So the outcome will be more likely to be one way or the other. Again, the field is called empirical research or empirical statistics. And you can combine that also with persuasion science, which is quite fascinating. And neuroeconomics is a great book on that. And the book Influence by Robert Cialdini is a good book on that if you want to start geeking out on persuasion science and get an idea of what's possible with manipulation of language and advertisement. You can absolutely do that. You can fudge around with those numbers and these questions in a way that you can manipulate the outcome to your liking. So understanding that, now you understand what my professor meant with don't trust the statistics you haven't falsified yourself, because it is very easy to falsify outcomes in questionnaires and surveys, if you want to. Or just be sloppy and it's still not going to produce a good result. So there's that, right? So that's a whole problem of questionnaires and surveys. So why do I bring this up and harp so much on questionnaires and surveys? Because in the dog training world, a lot of the dog training studies that prove, per se, they don't prove anything, but like they supposedly prove that all training should be just done with treats and that's good enough, a lot of them, 50, 60% of them, rely on questionnaires and surveys. And if you understand the inherent flaw of that, you can understand how the inherent conclusion from that is problematic. If my study is flawed in its setup, either because I fudged around with it or by its very nature, whatever the outcome is not something worth taking at face value. Right? So you would have to, you can take a questionnaire or survey as an input into a hypothesis. That would be a fair thing to do. I'm thinking maybe something's going on here. Let me ask people what they think, and so a majority of people think it's this direction. Okay, that makes sense. Let's test that. So taking a survey or a questionnaire as an input point for a hypothesis or your first experiment, that's a very fair thing to do. Using it as an outcome for and proclaim the results of fact is a very unfair, manipulative thing to do. So that's one thing. Let me give you another example of, actually let me give you two examples that are also dog related, and we don't have to go into the details of those studies specifically. I'm just going to give you a couple of highlights from them to highlight my point. We're going to discuss some of those studies in future podcasts in detail because they're super interesting. But here's the thing that happens a lot. Measuring cortisol in the dog's saliva to determine his stress level from a training approach with an aversive collar or an aversive tool versus treats. It's a very common approach that you see in a good amount of studies. So the testing cortisol in the saliva. That per se is not an unfair thing to be doing. No question about it. You can absolutely determine what's the stress level in a being by doing that. So that is scientifically sound in that aspect. But here's the thing, and that now requires understanding cortisol and how this works. If I produce a stressful event, let's be specific, let's not be abstract. Let's say I have a prong collar dog, give him a pup, stressful event, short impact, and it's like, oop, he goes like, and the cortisol spikes up, but that's all I did. I stopped right after. The cortisol will spike up from the stress and come back down quickly and dissipate very quickly. So we have a quick spike and then boom, comes back down. Cortisol spiked up, came back down very rapidly. Now we're comparing that with withholding a treat from a dog. not giving him a treat for lack of performance or breaking a command or whatever, withholding food basically, withholding a reward, which seems like a very mild thing to do. But if you measure the saliva, the cortisol response, you now have a spike that goes up, but it doesn't spike up in a straight line, like a quick spike up and come back down. It will go up in a more prolonged manner and stay up for a longer period of time and then slowly dissipate after. So there is far more stress measured by cortisol in saliva when you have the withholding of a reward versus a pop on a prong collar. So the stress of the cortisol stays up longer, stays up higher, far more prolonged exposure to the dog, far more stressful to the dog overall than a pop on a collar. So when you ask people, do you prefer withholding a food or popping a collar, withholding the food seems like the milder thing. If you study cortisol in this to prove your point, you would select at what point you measure the cortisol in the saliva. Let's assume they have like a continuous cortisol measuring system, some kind of thing in the dog's mouth or so. Right? You can look at the cortisol distribution. I mean, we know this from measurements. That's why I'm giving this example. If you wanted to prove that withholding food is more stressful, you'd measure the cortisol at the highest point. It was like, a couple of seconds, 10 seconds, 20 seconds. I forgot where exactly it was, but 30 seconds after the food was withheld, which is the high point, and then stays there for a while, you pick that 30-second point for measurement to prove, see, withholding the treat is more stressful, which would be the correct answer in this case, because that's how it is. If you wanted to, however, prove the opposite, you would put your measuring point of cortisol spike right at like the 5-second mark, right at the pop on the collar, where with the withholding of the treat, the cortisol is still in the rising phase and hasn't gotten very far, but on the collar, it was a shot up. So now I'm getting a super high cortisol level on the prong collar response, but it came right back down and ultimately was a far lesser impact on cortisol exposure than on the other one, but my measurement would clearly show, wow, it's higher here, when in totality that is not true. It's the wrong outcome because that's actually not the experience of the dog at all. And if you're fair and you look at the duration, you know exactly, well, this is a lot worse than the other one. But now by picking the cortisol measurement point, you can manipulate the outcome of this very easily. So that's my point. And you have no way, as a dog owner and reader, you have no way of knowing if that was done or not. You can read, we measured the cortisol at 10 seconds. Well, what's the cortisol distribution in sharp spikes or prolonged spikes? So how does this look like in different scenarios? If they're telling you they measured it at 10 seconds and they're not telling you why they measured it at 10 seconds, you have no idea of evaluating that, right? So it can be very difficult to discern if this makes any sense, because it does sound very reasonable when you just hear it. Well, we measured stress level based on cortisol, but what's wrong with that? Nothing inherently wrong with that. It just depends, are you trying to be honest about or not, right? So let me give you another example, also with dogs. And this is something that also happens regularly. And again, these are researchers now who actually are fair and want to do the right thing. So in this example I'm going to give you now, they're actually diligent people who want to do the correct thing and actually find the right outcome. But what they're doing ends up not producing that. And they don't know that. One thing that happens a lot when researchers want to evaluate the effect of electronic colors in dog training, which is still studied, they often go to the manufacturers of electronic colors and they ask them, well, recommend a couple of the top e-color trainers to us that we can work with to conduct our experiment. And they give them a list of names based on who they sell colors to or who they use for advertising or whatever, right? And then they work with them and say, hey, train the dog to do these 5 things and do what you do. And then they do the same thing with a force-free group of trainers who train only with treats and tell them the same thing, hey, train 5 dogs for these commands, do what you do. And they don't specify that further. They just want to now compare the effect of these two training methods in the outcome. And that all sounds above board and fair, and from their perspective, it is. And in these cases, as far as I understand, the researchers are not trying to be sneaky. They're actually trying to do the right thing. But, and here's the thing that, again, the average reader and listener has no way of evaluating. The researchers should know better, but they didn't, apparently. Without providing the exact sequence on how each of these trainings was conducted. So what exactly did the e-color trainers do? What exactly did the food-based only trainers do? What was the sequence of the command, the reward, the press of the button, the release of the button, the signal, the setup, everything, right? If we don't have step by step, we have no way of retesting this. We don't know what these people did. So if they don't provide that level of detail, we can't validate the result because there is detail missing. So when you read an abstract or you read a setup and you cannot reproduce this based on what's written there, if you could not do it, if you have even one question in your mind, well, how would I do this now? They didn't give you all the information to assess if this is a good study or not. And that should concern you when you look at a study. You shouldn't take a study at face value that doesn't give you the ability to retest their results, because you're supposed to be able to. That's the idea. Or at least tell you here at the bottom, if you want to retest this, we have more research product to give you. To do it, contact us here and we will provide it to you. That's a fair approach too, if they can't publish everything. Right? I mean, there's no reason they couldn't put it on YouTube, but if they would take a private route, they could still do that and give it to people who want it, but that they don't. So if you can't retest with what's provided, the result becomes meaningless. If you have a questionnaire or survey, it's no way it's going to be a valuable result. It can at best be a hypothesis or help you with your hypothesis. Again, the outcome to take it as a fact is impossible. The study becomes meaningless if it tries to present these things as facts. And then, like more technical things, well, we measured at 10 seconds. If they don't tell you why they measured at 10 seconds and what the distribution curve of each of these was and provide all the details, then again, you have no way of evaluating if that's a good way to measure this or not. So there's, again, the study is incomplete in terms of reporting the outcome and why it was done this way and what we saw, why we picked 10 seconds and not 15 or something like that. So these are the things you can look for. You can look for study survey, all the information there to retest. Is there an explanation of what was measured and why it was measured this way and no other way? So these like 3 quick things to skim and evaluate if a study is actually sound. And if you look back at the studies from the 1960s and 70s and 80s on dog training approaches, on operant conditioning, all the quadrants in it, and a classic conditioning, all the different types. If you look back at all those studies, they're all peer-reviewed, they're all tested, validated, they're cited all over the place. Nobody has ever been able to refute them. Many people have tried to validate them again and always succeeded. That's sound science. If you look at a lot of the studies in the last 10 years or so, you see far more surveys and questionnaires and far more studies that lack detail on how to reproduce them properly. That's concerning. And that's not just on dog training, it's in general. So there's this book, as I mentioned, Bad Science. I first heard about it from Tim Ferriss many years ago. And that's a good book that kind of gives you a little bit more insight into how to look at studies, how to evaluate these kind of research outcomes when they're published in the news, when they have a news report, hey, we found this and that thing. If you eat chocolate every day, you're going to die before you're 50. Well, I would be a living example of that not being true, but I like chocolate. But if you hear something like that, look at the study and look at it with the things that I just mentioned. Yeah? Is there all the detail to test it? Is this what the study actually says? The news likes to, with the studies that make it on TV, they usually pick out the thing that they find most interesting, and that may not be the main outcome or the main conclusion of that study per se. So I've done this a couple of times when things popped up in the news. Hey, new research study on this and that. And I read the study. Yeah, that's really not what they're trying to say here. Yes, it's in there, but that wasn't really the conclusion. You harped on something you found interesting, but that's not really what they're trying to do. Anyway, yeah. So Bad Science is a good book, and I I find reading studies interesting. I mean, most people may not. But as I read the abstract, which is like a quarter page, and then I read the setup. And then based on that, I decide if I read the rest or not. Because if these things aren't clean, there's no point in reading the rest. So why bring this up, right? So in the that was like a year or two ago. It was the American Veterinary Association published a position paper on the use of the prong collars or e-collars. I forgot, one of those two. Obviously, completely opposed to it. It's always opposed to things like that. And in their paper, in their published thing, they had a debate of like 20 or 21 studies, and that was one was a book, and I think 20 studies in the book. I think that's what it was, as evidence for their position. And 60% of those were questionnaires and surveys. And I looked at some of those even, and it was just like, wow. I mean, they don't even make an effort in those. And a couple of the others where there were questions about, well, how exactly was it done? You're not providing any detail. I mean, the setup overall sounds good. It doesn't sound bad what you're trying to do here. But without the details, we can't even know. And if you understand learning science and you see an outcome that contradicts what would happen if it's done correctly, you just know they did something incorrectly, but they didn't specify, so it's not easy to pinpoint. You just have to infer from the outcome. Because some things are literally impossible to happen if you do it correctly. But you can't know that as a dog owner. You can only know that if you actually have studied some of those the science behind some of that stuff, and it is your job, and you have the time to do this, and you need to do this to be good at what you're doing. So if it's your profession, in your profession, you can spot the fake stuff too, right? So whatever your job is, if somebody tries to BS you know within a couple of seconds the person you're talking to is just running their mouth and they have no idea what they're talking about. It doesn't matter what your job is. If you're somebody who's been doing it for a long time and knows it inside and out, and somebody comes in and tells you something about it, you know immediately, well, he doesn't know or she doesn't know, right? And this is the same when you read research papers. So if you look at them and you can't reproduce them, or they're fudging around with something, it's just like, okay, this is clearly not done in a way that would allow for objectivity. It's done in a way that either it's sloppy or it's malicious, which sometimes happens too, right? So there is that. So that was scientific studies. A couple of points on those, and I hope you find this interesting. I find this stuff interesting. Maybe I hope it doesn't bore you. We'll see. We'll see what the listening rate is. But I'm planning on doing a couple of podcasts down the line, maybe on a couple of specific ones that are super interesting in terms of their findings, because they're very counterintuitive and they're important to understand. I think whenever I share them with my clients in training sessions, they find them interesting too. And so they're always good discussion topics when I do sessions with my clients. So I figured they could be good discussion topics on a podcast as well. I think a lot of you will probably enjoy those. And yep, that's it for today. I hope this was informative and interesting enough to listen to the end. And I'll see you next time. Bye.